Good afternoon and welcome back, and welcome to those who are joining us online. Our next speaker is speaking to us from the Netherlands. Belgium, sorry? I've never been able to sort those two out. He's a Benedictine monk, Br Thomas Quartier OSB, at Keizersberg Abbey in Leuven, and is a professor of liturgical and ritual studies at the Stanford University and director of the Benedictine Centre at the same universities. And he's also a visiting professor at the Benedictine University, San Anselmo in Rome. So he's a great expert on funeral rites, mourning rites, but also on the Benedictine way of life. And he's recorded his talk for us, but he will be joining us on the Zoom shortly at the end of the thing, so we can have some discussion. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear brothers and sisters in Canterbury. Nice greetings from Mount Caesar's Abbey in Leuven, Belgium. Unfortunately, I cannot be with you physically, but I hope that I will be able to share with you some ideas about Benedictine tradition then and now, because it is an honor for me to contribute to your symposium on the 800th Jubilee of Lady Loretta. May it be a contribution to the exchange between England and the Low Countries, between the Anglican and the Roman Catholic ecclesial life, between our cultures. And let me add a personal note. I am very happy that Reverend Kevin Maddy, who is one of the researchers of the Benedictine Center for Liturgical Studies, of which I am the director, is among you and is one of the people who invited me. So thank you very much for that. And let's try to enter the School for the Lord's Service, which is the title that I gave to my lecture. The School for the Lord's Service is a strange school because it has an ultimate goal, not an operational goal. Much in a monastery seems senseless for modern people. The contemplative life is not effective as it seems. It does not have real results. And still, it might be that the Lord's service can be very meaningful to many people in our secular culture, in our church, but also outside the churches. What does it mean to really orient yourself towards your own inward path, and from that side on, try to contribute to a better world? To do so, I will share some parts of the Rule of Saint Benedict with you and try to translate these to monastic experience today, some theoretical reflections, and a little bit of research that we've been doing in our center. And I really hope that in that sense, we can share our inspiration, and I will be happy to answer your questions in the discussion rounds that are organized during this afternoon. Benedict of Nursia was born in 480. The 6th century in which he lived was a decadent time in the late Roman Empire, with great mobility among the people and a lot of oppression, a lot of conflicts. So it had some similarities with our time. Benedict reacted in the footsteps of the Desert Fathers, which you also talked about in this symposium, I'm sure, and lived in a cave in Subiaco near Rome for 3 years. But the unique contribution of Saint Benedict was to come out of the cave again, still be a monk, monos, to be on your own, to walk the inward path, but do that in a community. And for that community, it is necessary to create the school for the Lord's service, as Benedict says. And I quote from the prologue of the rule. Therefore, we intend to establish a school for the Lord's service. In drawing up its regulations, we hope to set down nothing harsh, nothing burdensome. The good of all concerned, however, may prompt us to a little strictness in order to amend faults and to safeguard love. Do not be daunted immediately by fear and run away from the road that leads to salvation. It is bound to be narrow at the outset. This quotation is a kind of signal to everybody who wants to be inspired by Benedictine spirituality to not expect only a feel-good spirituality. Benedictine spirituality is not only comforting, but it is confronting us with our own drifts, with our inclinations that are sometimes not productive in our life, that are bad for our balance. And that balance is rare. In most of the cases, we are not really in balance. So we have to work on that. And that is what Benedict says here. The Lord's service is the way to work on it. And this service has a twofold direction. It is the Lord serving us, but it is also us serving the Lord. And that brings us into a very typical characteristic of Benedictine spirituality, which is that it is a liturgical spirituality. The Lord's service means that we celebrate the liturgy, and we do that in a community with people who share the same desire as we feel, who share the same search. And Benedict says searching for God is the most important characteristic for a monk. That is what we need to search, not to find God. And how many people, dear brothers and sisters, search for meaning in their life these days? It's the age of the searchers that we live in. And perhaps this spirituality can offer us some perspectives on searching together with the many people who share the same desire also outside the churches. In modern philosophy in recent years, there has been some reflection on this Benedictine form of life, this monastic form of life as a liturgical form. One prominent figure in that is the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben, who developed a philosophy of form of life. And for him, the rule is very important. The rule of Saint Benedict being the most famous monastic rule we have in Western monasticism. I quote Agamben, a rule that covers not only separate actions, but the whole life is not recognizable as a rule anymore. A life that is fully determined by a rule is not a life in the full sense of the word anymore. To be identical with one's form of life means that one leads a liturgical life. One's whole existence is liturgy. If you enter a Benedictine monastery, you will immediately figure out that liturgy is central because there are a lot of prayer services, classically speaking, 7 a day, in many monasteries today, 6. But more than that, all the gestures, the clothing, the way they eat of the monks has a liturgical character. It is coded, it is ritualized. And this ritualized character makes that the monk is not focused as much on his individuality, but gives up that individuality to gain real freedom within his or her form of life. This is immediately a discussion point because in modern society, the individual freedom and individual creativity is very important. And if you would ask it to me as being a contemporary monk, I would say that is also very important to me. And I don't feel that my life is not a life in the full sense of the word, as Agamben suggests. It is a different way of life. And this otherness of monastic life can be disturbing. It can irritate people in society. And this disturbing character, this prophetic character of monastic life, is something that we often forget if we are too quickly inclined to see monasticism as a kind of self-confident and self-fulfilling way of life. No, it is a way of searching. It is a way of rebellion, if you wish. It is a microcosmos, and in that microcosmos, monks try to reorient their life in a radically different way. To do that, monks start in the first place not with a basic program, but with practices. In liturgical theology, you have the distinction between lex orandi and lex credendi, the law, the rule of prayer, and the law or rule of faith. We start with the practice, and in that practice, what we believe might become sensible, might occur, might emerge, and not the other way around. This is also a strange idea because we are used to focusing first on the content and then on the form. In monasticism, it is the other way around. The form brings you to the content, and the lex orandi is most clearly enacted in monasteries by having special moments. As I said, 7 or 6 times a day, the bell of the monastery rings. And I quote from the 43rd chapter of the Rule of Saint Benedict. On hearing the signal for the hour of the divine office, the monk will immediately set aside what he has in hand and go with utmost speed, yet with gravity, and without giving occasion for frivolity. Indeed, nothing is to be preferred to the work of God. End of quote. This again sounds pretty friendly. It sounds like a beautiful structure, but the experience can be different. Again, this is disturbing. When I'm working on my lecture for your symposium in Canterbury, the bell rings and I have to leave for Vespers. And I had an idea which I found brilliant, which I found so suitable for the topic that we're talking about. And I thought, oh my God, I have to write it. I have to keep it in mind. And when I come back from Vespers, I will immediately write it down. Nearly all of the time, the idea will be gone. But instead, there is a form of creativity, an openness of mind and heart, which you would not have without being interrupted by that which is really the core, which is the divine office. Guests sometimes ask me when they visit us here at Mount Caesar, well, what do you do all day as being Benedictine monks? Well, I explain them then a little bit ironically. We have 6 prayer services a day, 30 minutes each, a little bit of a break in between. So that is nearly 0.5 appointment praying. And then those people will say, we found, what do you really do? I can fully understand the question, as I also work outside the monastery as a university professor at 2 universities. But it makes clear that in the monasteries, the clock runs differently. What seems a break or an interruption outside the monastery is the center inside the monastery. It is a Copernican revolution every day. That which seems senseless, which is more a kind of recreational thing, sitting and singing, becomes the main task. And this upside down of what we are used to in normal life, which according to the rule of effectiveness, brings the freedom and the openness to really concentrate on your inner self and on your brethren around you. Students who visit me sometimes after a week say, oh, I worked on my thesis and I worked here in a week as much it would have cost me a month at home. As a professor, I'm happy about the progress in their thesis and their research. But as a monk, I have to say, well, you didn't really get what the core of Benedictine spirituality is, because we do not keep our temporal structure in the day to be more effective in what we already do. That is a side effect. The core is what seems to be the most senseless. And that is also true for the space. Benedict has a separate chapter on the oratory, the place for prayer, very often the most beautiful room of the monastery. And I quote, "The oratory ought to be what it is called, and nothing else is to be done and stored there. After the work of God, all should leave in complete silence and with reverence for God, so that a brother who may wish to pray alone will not be disturbed by the insensitivity of another." 52nd chapter of the rule. A senseless space that becomes the heart of the whole organism of the monastery. Those kind of places are very rare in our societies. Think about hospitals. In the Netherlands, which is a secularized country, more than half of the Dutch don't belong to any church or other religion. The hospitals had chapels in the past. They disappeared in many cases already 20 years ago. And they were replaced by silence centers, meditation centers, rooms, which is a beautiful thing. So everybody is welcome and everybody is able to find his or her way of finding his inner self there. But even these silence rooms are discussed now because they're not effective. And our health system is oriented on effectiveness. Hospital directors tell me, can you, as a professor of ritual, do research how effective that silence room is? Because it are the most expensive square meters of our hospital. We can never find money for that. And I always say, no, I cannot measure the effectiveness. Because even if it is a small number of people going in, then it is important for our institution as a hospital here that this room is there and it is not a multifunctional room. Again, a Copernican revolution, not finding the most useful room, the most important, but the most spiritual room. As I said, the lex orandi ritualizes life. And here is a small footnote from ritual theory. The British anthropologist Victor Turner already in the 60s said that the ritual structure helps us to cross borders. We enter an undefined field, which is the moments and the times I just talked about with the rule of Saint Benedict, and he calls that liminality, from limen, Latin, border. Liminal persons, Turner says, are structurally invisible. The liminal state within the ritual structure opens people for true freedom and independence. It is a source of creativity, if we follow the theory of Turner. Without that clear ritual structure that Benedictine spirituality is oriented towards, and without this structure being an internal in part of your life, no community can emerge. Symbolic meaning is coded in every life situation, but in monasteries very explicitly. And the transcendent meaning it reveals is unpredictable, sometimes even explosive. That last thought is Tom Driver, an American theologian relying on Turner in his book, Liberating Rites from 1998. So monks are, in their stability, in their form of life, open for creativeness. Creativity is the source of the search for God. And you could also call that the subversive character of monastic life. And think again about the Desert Fathers, who are at the very origin. It was a subversive movement, which did have already also a societal, even a political impact. From that, lex orandi, the lex credendi, the faith emerges, as I already said. And the most important characteristic of that, according to Saint Benedict, is inner balance or harmony. And I quote from the 19th chapter of the Rule, where Saint Benedict talks about singing psalms. We believe that divine presence is everywhere, and that in every place the eyes of the Lord are watching the good and the wicked. But beyond the least doubt, we should believe this to be especially true when we celebrate the divine office. The density of God, dear brothers and sisters, is the same everywhere. We cannot change that. It's the same at the station, in the shopping mall, in the monastery, and in your churches. What we can change is our own density, the density of our life, our openness, that makes us attentive for God's presence, that makes us attentive for the search and the openness that articulates our desire. And that is the same for believers or agnostics that very often visit monasteries today. I continue. Let us consider then how we ought to behave in the presence of God and his angels. And let us sing and stand and sing the psalms in such a way that our minds are in harmony with our voices. So just being there is, in a Benedictine sense, not enough. Singing is a very integral part of monastic life. But it is also not only an aesthetic purpose that we follow with it, but it has to do with the balance between our mind and our voice. Mens in Latin and vox. And it is very interesting that the mens, the spirit, is the inner self, whereas vox, your voice, is something bodily. So it is your inner and outer self, it is your spirit, your soul, and your body that can sometimes for a moment be in balance when you sing the psalms. And that act of singing is a symbolic expression of being really engaged in the ritual moments of the lex orandi that I've just been talking about. The faith that occurs from that is again unpredictable. It is open, it is subversive, it is creative, it is surprising. It can also be disappointing. But sometimes every now and then, when singing, moments can occur that help us understand what God's presence means. In an interview, I asked that to an old monk, and I said, well, you do that for decades now. Did you have that moments that the divine presence was nearby? And he said, well, perhaps. I said, well, very often. He said, well, probably 5 times. I said, okay, 50 years, 5 times. It's not really frequently. And he said, if I wouldn't have sung for 50 years, I would have missed these 5 moments. Unpredictable. The lex credendi then urges us to change our life and make the world a better place. And that better place is very much inspired by what we find in our search, but it is at the same time very flexible. Thomas Merton, a Trappist monk standing in the Benedictine tradition from the 20th century, wrote a lot about the relation between contemplation, what we just talked about, but then action. What is the impact of contemplation for your concrete life, for your responsibility? Isn't contemplation a little bit like spiritual narcissistic, looking at yourself? And why not help other people? Merton will say that you need to be as active as possible. The contemplation is a way of breathing in. And many monks today, including me, recognize that. We go to our cell, we breathe in, and we breathe out again. And that breathing out is what we contribute to the world, but it is coming from the contemplative basis that we celebrate in the choir stalls or in the moments that might be contemplative in your life that you have to discover. Action does not mean resigning yourself from works that seem alien to our life in God. And contemplation is not only a merely brief and satisfying interlude. No, action and contemplation, according to Merton, now grow together in one life and one unity. They become two sides of the same coin. Action is charity or love, looking outward to other men, and contemplation is charity or love drawn inward to its own divine source. Action is the stream, contemplation is the spring. This is a core phrase of Merton's. Action is the stream and contemplation is the spring. In our society, most of the people are very active. It is an ideal to be active, to swim in front of the stream and always be in motion. So the way to the spring and to be at the spring of your inspiration is not self-evident. And monasteries can have an important contribution here, I am convinced. A contribution that can really help people to rediscover the origin of their inspiration. But if you only sit at the spring, you will block it, you will lock it. And if you only swim, you will dry up. The balance is what we need. And that is the function of every church. So I am convinced that every parish needs to be a monastery in one or the other way, in a symbolic sense, of course. But it means that we have a core group guarantees to be open, of a contemplative nature, and around that there are concentric circles of active engagement. That would be really an important contribution of Benedictine spirituality today. Ladies and gentlemen, I really believe that in this way we can use Benedictine spirituality as a model for monasteries today, that are laboratories of the Lord's service, laboratories of the inspiration that every person can find, and that is fed by scripture, that is fed by sacraments, but that is relying on a very broad and universal desire that inspired huge parts of the mystical tradition. And I am also convinced that this is important for churches. We did, and that is towards the end of my lecture, some research among Benedictine oblates. Father Kevin, who is a good friend of mine, is a Benedictine oblate, so I am happy to present very shortly a few insights from the research here today. If you want to read more about it, you can see that in some of my publications. One is online in the journal Religions, Monastic Form of Life Out of Place. Oblates are lay persons affiliated to a Benedictine abbey. In this qualitative research in our Benedictine Center for Liturgical Studies, we did research among 53 oblates in the Netherlands. Here's some findings. First, oblates, male and female, structure their day by keeping meditative silence in the morning and the evening. They create their own divine office in their family, in the way they live. Perhaps they live alone, but they often miss common moments and fixed places for prayer. And that is exactly the challenge we all face. Second, oblates feel the need to experience their faith, but often miss the inner peace in their everyday life. Oblates want to live out Christian values, that is the third point, but often miss the plausibility among the people around them. So both bringing faith and Christian values into your concrete life is not self-evident today in a secular society. But in the Netherlands, we also experience that the hostility towards Christian message is decreasing. There might be a new openness, and the archetype of monks, whether they live in the monastery or whether they're as oblates or in any other form of life live outside, is attractive to many people and is an important form of apostolate. So let's work on that. Oblates do find, we know that from our research, support in the affiliation to their abbey, in their spiritual life and in their fellow oblates. To create these places means to create laboratories for the Lord's service today, and that is worth it. I summarize. I hope that you found these very short explorations in one way or the other clarifying or it raised questions, and I will be happy to discuss those with you after the lecture in the talks that we are going to have. What we saw is the lex orandi, the law of prayer, which moments form interruptions in my daily routine and make me open for prayer, and which places are helpful for me to be open and find space to pray. That brings us to the lex credendi. What do moments and places of prayer mean for my spiritual life? And how is my faith related to rituals that I conduct regularly to bring me in balance? Finally, the lex vivendi. What are the implications of my spiritual life for my behavior in my family, at work, and in society? And when do rituals become a source of inspiration for my life that make me live better, make the world a better place, and serve the Lord as we all live in the school for the Lord's service? Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your attention. Once again, my apologies that I couldn't be here. I want to congratulate you also on behalf of my brethren here in the Abbey of Mount Caesar, my colleagues in the University of Nijmegen, and I hope that you have a beautiful celebration and interesting questions. And I will be happy to meet you all in the discussion. And thank you very much.